Hello class, and today we're going to talk about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a really important cell process that your body uses in order to obtain needed energy. And here we just have some runners who are obviously using some of that energy. Your body, remember from the first section in this unit, uses energy for a whole bunch of different things: chemical reactions, keeping warm, muscular responses. And in order to tap into that energy as a member of the Animalia kingdom and other kingdoms as well, other eukaryotic kingdoms, we use cellular respiration. Our cells use that process. That process involves breaking down sugars and other substances and giving off carbon dioxide and water. That's the simple overview of cellular respiration. There are two different kinds of cellular respiration. We have aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration occurs in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic respiration occurs without oxygen. And we are going to talk about aerobic respiration in this section. In the very next section, we'll discuss anaerobic respiration. But for right now, we're going to talk about cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen. And this is the chemical formula for that. Just as we had a chemical equation for photosynthesis, we can also write aerobic respiration with a chemical equation. And we start with glucose, and that's the chemical formula and the compound of glucose. You don't need to remember the chemical formula or memorize it for the test, but it's important just that you be able to see it and start getting familiar with it. Glucose combines with oxygen, and we actually have one glucose molecule. In order to break it down, it needs 6 oxygen molecules. That produces, in the very end of this entire process, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and a bunch of ATP, which, remember, is our cellular energy. So let's look at these steps more in detail. We have 3 stages or steps of aerobic respiration. The first one is glycolysis. The second one is the Krebs cycle. And the third one is the electron transport system. So if we look at the first one right here, glycolysis, and don't be intimidated by this chart. Let's just pick out the important parts. Glycolysis is our first step, and I tried to color code this. The Krebs cycle is the second step, and then here the electron transport system is the third step. And those sound like big words, but we're going to look at exactly what they mean. You can see in this overall cycle that some ATP is given off in each of these steps, but by far the most ATP is given off in this very last step. So let's look at the first step in cellular respiration, glycolysis. Now, I don't want you to be intimidated by this chart. You don't need to memorize everything on this chart, but I want you to get familiar with how things are written in a diagram for these different processes. And I'd like you to know very, very much what we start with, what we end with, different things that we use, and other products that happen in here. So let's look at what we start with for glycolysis. We start with a glucose molecule. It's made of 6 carbons. And right here is what we're starting with, a glucose molecule. And on this little chart, they represent the carbon with the little gray looking spheres. Glucose has 6 carbons, and that's what we start with. Glucose is broken down, and you can see that right here, and we end with a broken down version. We have 2 molecules that only have 3 carbons in each of them, and we call each of those a pyruvate molecule. So that is what we end with in glycolysis. We have some other products. We have ATP, and we have some electrons that we get out of this process. And when you read the chart, you can see that in phase 1, there's an energy investment. We start with some ATP, and we use it up here in some of these steps. And in the energy payoff phase, right here, we are generating ATP down here. So in the end, we're producing ATP and storing it up. We're also producing some electrons, and we're going to use those electrons in a later phase. So the second step in cellular respiration, and if you look on our little chart, here's our second step, it's the Krebs cycle. You will also hear the Krebs cycle referred to as the TCA or citric acid cycle. Those all mean the very same thing. They're all referring to this step in cellular respiration. Now, once again, you don't need to worry about this. I just want to walk you through how to read some of these charts. So in the Krebs cycle, we start with pyruvate. Remember, we ended with pyruvate after glycolysis. We converted a glucose molecule into 2 pyruvate molecules. Now we have our pyruvate molecules. They're 3 carbon molecules. As they cross the membrane into the mitochondria, they are converted into acetyl coenzyme A molecules, or acetyl-CoA. Those are only 2 carbons each, so they're small. One thing that's important to notice, glycolysis is taking place in the cytosol, or in the cytoplasm of the cell. That's where glycolysis takes place. The Krebs cycle is going to take place inside the mitochondria. Remember the mitochondria we called the powerhouse of the cell? That's because the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system happen there. That's part of our cellular respiration process. And in the end, it produces a tremendous amount of ATP, which is energy that our body can use. So, as the pyruvate is converted into acetyl coenzyme A, we are then beginning our Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. And the Krebs cycle starts with this acetyl coenzyme A. It uses this to go through a cycle, okay? And this 2-carbon compound combines with something that the cycle is already producing, a 4-carbon compound. And those are entering the cycle to give us ATP. A waste product will be carbon dioxide. Another thing we gain is multiple electrons and other energy molecules. So when you see these words NADH or FADH2 or GTP, those are simply other different energy molecules, very similar to ATP. You don't need to memorize them, but when you see them on these charts, those are representing other molecules that either store energy or give us electrons that we can use later in our other steps. So it's important to remember we start with the pyruvate that's converted into acetyl-CoA. We get a little bit of ATP, we get some electrons to use in our next step, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct. Number 3, electron transport system. This is what we've been talking about and anticipating, waiting till we finally get to this electron transport system, right? So it's the last step in cellular respiration. It uses some of those electrons that we've been producing. Remember, we produced some electrons in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle, and now we're going to use them in this electron transport system. What in the world do these electrons do? They enable us to pump hydrogen across the cell membrane. Okay? Now remember, active transport is going to happen here. Remember when we talked about active transport, we're going to use energy in order to move substances from a low concentration gradient into a high concentration gradient. And that is exactly what these electrons are going to do. We're going to use some of that ATP we've produced, and we're going to move these protons, these hydrogen ions, through the molecule to the other side, through the membrane onto the other side of the membrane, and create a concentration gradient where we have all these protons out here that are really just dying to get back in through this membrane. But they can't, because remember, they're charged molecules and they cannot cross the membrane. So there they are outside the membrane waiting to get back in. Now, our electron transport system features this item right here. An ATP synthase complex. Sounds really big and maybe really imposing, but all it is a mechanism whereby these protons can come back into our mitochondria, back in through this cell membrane, or this mitochondrial membrane. And when they do this, this synthesizes or makes ATP. The protons coming back in here enable this to make ATP from ADP, and in this one step alone, we produce the vast majority of all of the ATP that we get out of cellular respiration. So this process right here is very important. As the protons come back across the membrane, they come through this ATP synthase complex, and ATP is generated. Now, what other things are needed for this to happen? We said we need the electrons that we generated in our glycolysis and Krebs cycle. We also need oxygen. This is where oxygen is very critical. If we do not have oxygen, everything stops. This whole process ceases. ATP is not generated. Protons are not put across the membrane. We don't have this happening. So oxygen is very critical. So we need electrons and oxygen for our electron transport system. And what do we produce in this step? Water and large amounts of ATP. Okay, let's do a little review. This is a lot of information. This is a very detailed process. And let's step back and think about our whole cycle one more time. We have the first step. We have glycolysis. We produce a little bit of ATP. We produce electrons. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. Those electrons are going to be used in a later step, in our third step of electron transport. Now, we cross over into the mitochondrion for our Krebs cycle. Now remember, the pyruvate molecules that we produce in glycolysis are going to be converted into acetyl-CoA, or acetyl coenzyme A, and those are going to enter the Krebs cycle, where we are going to produce some more electrons, a little bit of ATP, and we're going to send our electrons over to the electron transport chain. And the third step then is our electron transport chain, where we use those electrons produced by glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, and we get a whole bunch of energy that comes out of this process. In this process, remember, we must have oxygen or it will not happen. Oxygen is very important. And here we have our overall chemical equation for aerobic respiration. We start with the glucose right here in glycolysis. We must have oxygen. Remember, we're using our oxygen in this step. And the products are going to be CO2 that is given off. We give off CO2 in the Krebs cycle. We give off water, and we get a lot of ATP. That would be energy in our form of ATP. So if you'd like to look into this further, aerobic cellular respiration can definitely be described in more detail. You can understand some of those intermediate steps within the different steps of cellular respiration itself, the different intermediate molecules that are produced. There are enzymes that are used to make these reactions happen. There are a whole lot of chemical reactions that take place. Please look into that if you're inclined to, if you're interested in getting advanced proficiency, and I look forward to seeing what you have to show me.